Skyward Sword HD is finally here, and alongside its upgraded visuals and a higher frame rate are a whole bunch of little changes and improvements that easily make this the definitive version of this game. I've always been a big fan of Skyward Sword. It was the first Zelda game I played on a Nintendo home console hooked up to a TV and not a handheld, so when I first played it, this game felt like a big, exciting adventure unlike anything I had experienced before. I had a very positive experience with this game, but one quick visit to the internet and you'll find a pretty mixed reception. Skyward Sword has always been one of the most divisive Zelda games, for a variety of different reasons. Motion controls, pacing issues, and a lot of small annoyances made the experience frustrating for a lot of players, and the game has gathered a lot of hate over the years because of that. I had my own complaints about the game back on Wii, but I always felt that the good far outweighed the bad. There's some fantastic storytelling in this game, and it has all the amazing things you'd expect from a Zelda game like great dungeons and beautiful music. I couldn't wait for this game to be ported to Switch so it could finally get the second chance I knew it deserved. And now, almost 10 years later, we have a new and improved version of this game on Switch, and I'm happy to say that Skyward Sword is now better than it ever has been. With lots of the original issues solved, the strongest parts of this game can truly shine. It's still not perfect, but this is an epic adventure that you don't want to miss. Let's go over all the new changes in this HD remaster, and then talk about the game as a whole after that. I'll be using footage from various different sections of this game, but for the most part there won't be any heavy story spoilers. The first and most obvious new change in this remaster are the visuals. The original on Wii was stuck with a 480p resolution, and now that's been bumped all the way up to a full 1080p HD. Skyward Sword's art style holds up really well and looks amazing with this higher resolution. It's managed to keep its watercolor style while improving the clarity at the same time. This is one of my favorite Zelda art styles, and it looks so great in HD. Another big improvement is that the game runs at a buttery smooth 60 FPS, which is the first time a 3D Zelda game has ever had that high of a frame rate. The 60 FPS frame rate improves the feel of the game a lot, and even makes motion controls feel smoother too. I really hope all future 3D Zelda games will have 60 frames per second, because I really don't want to go back to 30 after playing this game. I mentioned earlier that motion controls was one of the reasons Skyward Sword was so controversial, and thankfully that's been addressed this time around. The original motion controls are still available, but there's also some brand new button controls. This is a great new addition so people who don't like motion controls can still enjoy this game. Personally, I still prefer the motion controls since that's what the entire game is designed around and it feels the most natural. But I did try out the button controls and they work pretty well. Of course it's not perfect since the game wasn't made to be played with a normal controller, but it works about as well as I thought it would. You flick the right stick to swing your sword, and other things that were previously motion-based like loft wing flying and swimming are now controlled with buttons too. The only problem I have with this control layout is that you don't have easy access to the fully controllable 3D camera since you use your sword with the right stick. You can still rotate the camera, but you have to hold L and then use the right stick. This messed me up a lot and I was never able to get used to it. I'm sure it's something you can adjust to over time, but I decided to stick with the motion controls where you can control the camera like normal. The motion controls work about as well as they did on Wii, although you do have to recenter more often since the Switch doesn't have a sensor bar. That can be slightly annoying, but once it's all synced up, everything works pretty well. I never had any major issues with the game registering my movements, but every once in a while something didn't work quite right. Usually it's trying to stab forward. I do wish there were a few more options to mess around with, so maybe you could have a motion-controlled sword but have everything else be button-based. But this is Nintendo we're talking about, so you either have full motion controls or full button controls. It's a bummer that there isn't one definitive way to control this game, as either way you'll probably still have to deal with some level of awkwardness. I really do like the motion controls, but if someone else doesn't, they'll have to compromise their experience in some way, which is unfortunate. Overall though, I think these new control options are great, and hopefully it means that more people can experience this game and choose the control style that works for them. This remaster also improves a lot of the small annoying things that were in the original game. Item descriptions no longer appear every time you collect an item after exiting the game, there's a new autosave system, dialogue can be skipped through, there's faster load times, and cutscenes can now be skipped too. This is a really small thing, but I love the new text in the opening and how similar it is to Breath of the Wild. It somehow makes the beginning even more cinematic than it already was. I think the two biggest quality of life improvements are reducing Fi's amount of dialogue and the 3D camera control. Fi used to interrupt your game constantly, delivering you tons of information that you probably already knew. It made the whole game feel very handholdy, and could be really frustrating when Fi would straight up spoil how to solve puzzles. But in this remaster, they removed almost all of Fi's annoying dialogue. Fi now only comes out when necessary for the story, or when you're doing something really stupid. This change is huge and really improves the overall pacing. Combine that with the ability to fast forward through dialogue and less tutorials in general, playing Skyward Sword feels much less like a chore than it used to. Probably my favorite change is the addition of 3D camera control, since it changes the way you interact with the world. Being able to get a better look at your surroundings and rotate the camera freely changes the entire feel of the game and makes the gameplay so much better. So far, everything new has been 100% positive. But sadly, Nintendo decided to make a Zelda and Loftwing amiibo that unlocks a new fast travel system. The amiibo looks gorgeous, but it really shouldn't unlock a quality of life feature. Yes, there are plenty of bird statues around the map, but there's no excuse to make a new feature like this and lock it behind an amiibo. The price of Skyward Sword HD is also another topic of debate, but this video isn't about Nintendo's recent pricing decisions. Even with the base game's problems mostly fixed, somehow Skyward Sword still managed to stir up some controversy. But I do think the actual game itself has been improved for the better. And that's all the HD remaster talk, so now let's move on to the base game itself. Skyward Sword has a heartfelt and emotional story, with lovable characters that change and evolve as the story progresses. This is easily my favorite version of Zelda in the whole series. She feels like a real person, and the connection between her and Link is perfect. There's also an amazing supporting cast of characters like Fi, Girahim, Groose, and Impa. Now that she's much less annoying, you can really get invested in the best aspects of Fi's character. Girahim is such a unique and interesting villain, and he gets so much time to shine during the story. Groose starts out as your typical high school bully, but he gets a sincere and genuine character arc that will make you love him. Impa's character is no nonsense and straight to business, but you can tell how much she cares about Zelda. And no spoilers, but the ending is so climactic, beautiful, and satisfying. As you play through the story, you do have to revisit the same 3 areas multiple times, which can make the pacing feel pretty slow, especially in the second half of the adventure. Each time you revisit the areas, they are very different, but it can feel like padding when you keep going back to the same places. The game is pretty linear overall, which isn't necessarily a bad thing, but it can feel restricting at times. But luckily, the level design of each location is so great that it's a joy to work your way through all the different areas. And I think the linear game design allows the story to take on a more important role, and it's totally worth it. But fighting the imprisoned so many times is pretty irritating. 1 or 2 times would have been okay, but fighting him 3 times feels unnecessary. Another common complaint about this game is the Silent Realm sections, but I actually really like these. Yes, they are very stressful, but I think they're pretty fun. Skyward Sword HD definitely still has its problems, but it really just comes down to personal opinion how much you enjoy this game's story. And for me, I absolutely love it despite its flaws. This is not only one of my favorite Zelda stories, but one of my favorite video game stories in general. This game is split into 2 main sections, the sky and the surface. Sadly, the sky is pretty barren, with just a few floating islands and not much else. Most of the islands are home to goddess chests, which can be opened once you hit the corresponding goddess cube on the surface below. I like this mechanic, but it's definitely not as interesting as the many different islands you could explore in the Wind Waker. Thankfully, flying around on your Loftwing is tons of fun, so that alone makes exploring the sky much more interesting. Upgrading your gear is a new system that requires you to collect certain items to improve your stuff. This is a really great new addition that makes using your items and gear much more exciting, and it's totally optional, so the game gives the player some freedom when it comes to Link's items and how you use them. The side quests in this game are really great, with likable characters involved and fun plotlines to explore when you're not directly searching for Zelda. Skyward Sword's side quests highlight one of my favorite things about this game. There's just so much personality in everything you do. From Beetle kicking you out of his shop if you don't buy anything, to the amazing sequence where you break a chandelier and have to pay it off by doing chores, I was constantly smiling while playing through this game. All the residents of Skyloft and the creatures on the surface are full of life and super charming to interact with. Another one of the best parts of this game are the incredible dungeons. Dungeons are always one of the best parts of any Zelda game, and Skyward Sword has some of the best out of the whole series. The dungeon design has been refined to near perfection. Classic Zelda gameplay doesn't get much better than this. The puzzles are the perfect level of difficulty. The answer isn't immediately clear, but you won't spend hours wondering what you're supposed to be doing. And it always feels so great to finally solve a tricky puzzle you've been stuck on. Everyone always highlights the ancient cistern, and for good reason. This dungeon has an amazing theme, with the surface being heavenly, and then you descend down into the dark depths of the underworld. The Lanayru mining facility and sand ship have this really awesome time stone mechanic where you explore both the past and present versions of the dungeon. All the dungeons make great use of their specific items, with puzzles and enemy encounters that make clever use of each item's abilities. And there's also some pretty fantastic bosses. Not all of them, but there are memorable fights like Koloktos. And fighting Girahim is always great, and I love how he progressively gets more difficult every time you face him. The music is another one of the best parts of Skyward Sword, with fully orchestrated songs for every moment of the game. Zelda music is always good, but there's something extra special about this game's soundtrack. There's a new level of emotion in the songs, and the soundtrack can create an amazing sense of atmosphere. Just to name a few, there's the relaxing music of Skyloft, the triumphant theme of the sky, and Fi's incredible melody. I don't think there's a single bad song in this entire game. Skyward Sword's music somehow makes the story and gameplay even better, and the game wouldn't be the same without its terrific music. The Legend of Zelda series was recently changed forever with Breath of the Wild, and as much as I loved that game, I did find myself missing some of the more traditional parts of this series. Skyward Sword HD has all the best parts of the classic Zelda formula I was missing, and I think it's still one of the very best Zelda games. It does have its issues, mainly the pacing and some awkward controls, but it's such a great game despite all that. I consider Skyward Sword HD to be a flawed masterpiece. Just because it isn't perfect doesn't mean it isn't an amazing game. And pretty much any widely beloved video game can fall under that same title. There's no such thing as a completely perfect game. It's all about which flaws you're willing to overlook to get to the best aspects of the experience. Yes, maybe Skyward Sword has more flaws than most other 3D Zelda games, but most of the biggest issues have been solved with this HD remaster. And the few problems that are still left are easily worth dealing with because of the incredible story, impressive dungeon design, beautiful visuals, and fantastic music. I absolutely adore this game, and I'm so glad it finally got an HD remaster on Switch. But what do you think about Skyward Sword HD? Do you love it even more than me, or do you think it's one of the worst 3D Zelda games? Let me know down in the comments, just try and keep it respectful. Thanks for watching guys, and I'll see ya in the next one.